Hi, I'm Stewart Spinks and welcome to episode 328 of my podcast, Beekeeping Short and Sweet. Well, this week, another treat for you. I've been joined by an old friend and fellow bee farmer, Paul Horton from Apidea Honey, and he's here to talk about what he's calling his perfect storm of a 2024 season. Beekeeping Short and Sweet, a beekeeping podcast for the inquisitive beekeeper with a short attention span. A beekeeper, in fact, just like me. Hi everyone, welcome back to the podcast. Yet another week goes by and I've got another treat for you. I'm joined today by Paul Horton from Apidea Honey, who has kindly agreed to sit in the office for half an hour and chat to me about an article that he wrote for the Bee Farming Association magazine called Bee Farmer, and it's called The Perfect Storm, and it basically runs through his 2024 season, and there's some really interesting stuff in there, so I thought you'd all like to hear it. Paul, hi, you're very, very welcome. Good to see you again.
Nice to see you. Thanks for having me again.
Oh, of course, we're on the podcast, and good to see you. We're on Zoom, everybody, so we're recording it on Zoom. Now, you'll all remember that Paul and Steve Donahoe wrote Healthy Bees, Heavy Hives, How to Maximize Your Honey Crop. A fantastic book. If you're looking for a Christmas present, then get it on your list quickly because they're bound to sell out pre-Christmas. So just make sure you've got that one on your Santa Claus list. Paul, this perfect storm of a season, you've called the article Perfect Storm. It's just an amazing story of one beekeeping season. Can we just cover off all the basics first so people can identify who you are and where you are and what you've been doing? So, how long have you been beekeeping? Let's kick off with that one.
I would say 15 years now. I've been a bee farmer as my living, doing it as a job. But I grew up around bees, even though I wasn't that keen on them when I was a kid. But my dad was a bee farmer, so I've been around them all my life, really.
And you're now running your own bee farming business, focusing on honey production, I guess?
Yeah, we do sort of pollination and honey production. The honey production is the bulk of the turnover, really. But we sort of diversified a bit over the years, a bit of bulk, a bit of jars now. We sell quite a bit in jars. So yeah, changes over the years, really.
And the question that I'm always asked is, how many colonies do you run?
We've just gone into winter with 272, I think 273, somewhere around that. But it fluctuates, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. What was your position at the beginning of the season in 2024?
We were just under 250, I think we came out of winter with viable, queen right, after we'd united a few up and shook a few out. So yeah.
Sure. So what I'd like to do is just go through the article and throw a few questions at you, highlight a few of the comments that I don't know if you can remember what you said at the time, but I'll throw a few of the comments at you and see how we get on. So first off, the season started, I think, for me, really poorly. It was really wet. Was that what you encountered?
Yeah, it was very wet, wasn't it? We were lucky. A lot of my wintering sites have good access, so we were still able to get to the bees up until sort of mid-April-ish. So that wasn't too bad. But because we're quite highly migratory, we start to thin out our wintering sites in late March, early April. So the problem arose when we arrived at the other sites at the other end. That's where it became difficult and boggy, and yeah, the nightmare began, really. Yeah.
And in terms of your migratory beekeeping, it sounds like you start really early. So where do you go? Not specifics, but what crops are you pollinating that early in the season?
So sort of early April, we have cherries and apples down in Kent, and pretty much every site we went to down there, we needed the grower with his tractor pulling us around the orchard. So it's always fun. Yeah, that's the first moves of the year: apples, cherries.
Okay. Yeah. And just going back and preparing your colonies for this season, do you treat in the autumn and treat over winter, anything like that?
Yeah, I try and treat 3 times a year. So everything will get something after the heather. So late August, early September, we'll treat with something like Apivar, Formic, something like that. Oxalic, mid-December time. And then we try and slip a treatment in March time when we first start to get into the colonies, which is a lot earlier than most people should be opening up the hives, but we're kind of pushed to get in them early. But we'll put something like a thymol in quite early, just for 3 or 4 weeks. Even though the temperature is probably not ideal for thymol, I just, even if it's doing 10% of, it's something.
Sure.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay.
Yep.
And so winter losses are normally fairly low.
They were low. The bees came through as good as I've had them come through winter in quite a few years, to be honest. Losses were about 6 or 7%, which is normal for us. Between 5 and 10 is kind of the where we usually are. So
Yeah.
nothing abnormal this year. Yeah.
Sure. Okay. And other than the migratory phase of your beekeeping, do you have crops like oilseed rape locally to you that you use?
Yeah, we do. It's becoming a challenge. This year was the first year we've struggled to sort of have access to oilseed rape. We had to move onto different farms that we haven't worked with before, and had to go a bit further sometimes to get onto oilseed rape. And winter beans is the main one we chase in the spring. That was a real challenge finding winter beans. So
And one question I get asked lots of questions, but another question that people ask me is, how do you find sites? How do you contact uh, the farmers? How do you find a new location that looks as if it might dish up some nice nectar for your bees?
it's a good question, and probably a good year for me to answer it, because I've had to sort of go through it a bit this year. We start by just asking which farmers we know. Do you know, have they got any friends and colleagues that have oilseed rape or field beans? And that leads to a few connections, and it certainly led to a couple of good sites for me this year. Also, on your travels when you're driving around, that always helps. If you spot something that looks like the crop you want, just go knocking on doors, trying to investigate who that crop belongs to. That always helps. But this year, I even resorted to sharing on the local farming page on Facebook, Lincolnshire Farmers, and I got a couple of sites from that.
Oh, that's a good
So
idea.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. So that helped.
With it being a pretty dire spring, and
Mm.
certainly I found that it was pretty rubbish all round for me. Did you go through a process of taking honey off early, or did you decide that actually it was better to leave supers on with food in? I know our weather is always so fickle, and you can never really tell whether or not it's the right thing to do. But did you take a spring crop, or did you leave any with the bees?
A bit of both. So April was poor, but it's kind of normal, really. April can be good or bad, can't it? So I didn't think there was anything really abnormal about April, and then we got into early May, and there was a brief spell of quite good weather, sort of 10-day window at the beginning of May, and we got a decent enough crop off the oilseed rape and winter sown beans. So the bees did okay, and then from sort of mid-May onwards, that's when the weather really clamped down. And we did take some spring honey off late in May, but our hand was forced, because at that point we were getting ready to move the bees onto the next crop, which
Right.
was mustard and spring sown field beans. So we can't move the bees with sort of 2 and 3 supers on. So we had to take some off, but the weather was still horrendous. So we did leave one super on every hive. Not necessarily full, maybe 2/3 full, the
Yeah.
supers that were not finished yet. We left on the hives. And then we took the more ripe supers in late May. So yeah.
And did you find that the weather continued to create havoc for you in the late spring?
Yeah, when I cropped the honey, when I cropped some of the spring honey, I do remember thinking to myself, there is literally no way this bad weather can just continue. We're going to have another week of it and it'll improve. And all the weather apps were showing that. We kept getting teased. 10 days time. Look, there's a bright warm spell coming, and it just never came, did it? So yeah, it just never let up. Then from sort of mid May all the way through to mid June was just cold, windy, wet. It was the worst spring I think I've dealt with personally.
And I guess a lot of beekeepers that are listening to this will be backyard beekeepers, as they get called, and have 2 or 3 beehives at the bottom of the garden, and throwing a bit of food on them late spring because there's not much around isn't a major problem. for someone like yourself, feeding your bees must be incredibly time consuming and potentially expensive. How did you cope with the any feeding that you had to do?
I'm really reluctant to feed after. Well, I mean, I don't even like feeding in spring, to be honest. Not a liquid feed. If we can feed enough in autumn, it's usually enough to get them through,
Yeah,
with a bit of fondant and things. So I'm very almost paranoid these days of overfeeding in spring or certainly feeding in the summer. I don't think people realize the risk of contaminating your honey with syrup. It's there are stories you hear back from people that used to dye their syrup with like red or green or blue dye, some artificial color, and they would still be finding traces of syrup 6 months later, and
right.
it makes me very paranoid to feed, even in a dearth like May and
Sure,
June.
sure.
So at the time, the bees had a super of honey, so that kept them going for a little bit. That kept them going into early June. But they soon devoured that because the bees were strong and they ate through that very quickly. And that's when I started to feel a bit like a failure of a beekeeper, that I didn't leave more food on them, more honey on them. So I resorted to something I've never done before, which was feeding honey back to the bees, and it was old honey. It was old oilseed rape honey from 2 or 3 years ago, and you'll know what I mean by this, Stuart. It was just starting to turn. It was like not fermented, but you lifted that lid and you could smell
Yeah,
it was
yeah,
starting to
yeah.
turn. So we scraped the top inch or so of that off, which is usually the bit that is starting to ferment, and then we watered it down. We basically made a 1-to-1 syrup out of this old honey, out of desperation, really. And I fed that to the colonies using frame feeders, which I'd recently bought,
Okay.
luckily, which
Yeah.
I've never used frame feeders before. That was just a recent purchase, weirdly enough.
Any particular reason for suddenly deciding to buy some frame feeders?
At this point, no, it was I don't know why I bought those actually. We use dummy boards in all our hives, and I'd found these frame feeders that were the exact same dimensions as the dummy boards we use. And I remember thinking, well, it's a lot more useful than a dummy board, basically, to
Yeah,
fit the
yeah,
same
sure.
space. I found a good deal. And I bought a load of those.
I didn't ask, but
Yeah.
I'm gonna ask on behalf of the listeners now. Are you
Right.
running national beehives?
Yeah, this is probably why we started to encounter issues earlier than other people. We are running single national hives. So once the bees had devoured what honey was in the supers, and obviously the colonies were building up by this point, there's very little stores in the brood nest in prolific colonies in nationals, single nationals. So yeah, this is one of those years where or one of those scenarios where actually we flew a bit close to the sun with single nationals, I think. So yeah, it was getting to the point where the forecast was just not looking like it was going to pick up. The bees were getting very close to eating what stores they had, and it's difficult to know what to do at this point because, and this is why I resorted to feeding honey back, because the weather can turn at any point,
Yeah,
and I didn't want frame feeders full of syrup, or I didn't want to strip all the supers off because the bees were so strong at this point to feed with a top
yeah,
feeder.
yeah.
We could have put fondant on. That probably would have been a safe option as well. So yeah, so we ended up feeding this honey syrup back to the bees, which is usually a big no-no, as you'll remember from bee inspecting. It comes with risks if there was a disease issue, certainly.
How did you feel about that? I guess there's also a dysentery
Yeah,
potential problem with it, but more likely, well, not more likely, but a potential greater threat with the spread of a foul brood disease or something like that. How did you feel
absolutely.
about that?
Yeah, it's a risk. We haven't had an issue with disease in quite a few years, so I wasn't too concerned. That's not to say it's not there and I've missed it, but I wasn't too concerned. And like I said, this honey was a few years old as well, and I vaguely remember reading an article when I was a bee inspector. It was something like foul brood can only survive after, I think, from not much more than a year or 18 months outside of
Okay.
brood. So
Yeah.
there was that sort of in the back of my mind, thinking, well, this is over 2 year old honey; it should be safe.
And I
But
guess you're not really thinking in terms of American foul brood here.
no,
That's
it's
a
European.
very remote possibility in the back of your mind, but it's more European foul brood.
Yeah,
Yeah, I would
absolutely.
agree.
But you're right. Dysentery was also a concern, but It's surprising how quickly it fermented. Actually, the honey syrup that we made up, what we
Right.
didn't use in the end, it started to turn to mead within a few days. But no, the bees devoured it incredibly quickly. We were having to go around twice a week, almost
Right.
topping up these feeders. It was, and we were making the honey syrup to order essentially.
Yeah, yeah. And did that work? Did you lose any colonies?
No, we didn't, amazingly. There was a few that were very close. We had a couple of colonies that we took down to the Mustard, which is at the time was probably my furthest site from home. We're nearly 2 hours away.
Okay.
Um, and I got down there, and some of them were right at that tipping point, where they get very still, very lethargic, just on the verge. And it was literally spraying syrup and pouring syrup onto them to get them back. And the next time I returned, they were back. They were okay. We were very
Yeah.
close.
Again, for those listening, in an emergency, there's absolutely nothing wrong with grabbing some syrup and just literally pouring it over the bees and getting it onto the bees so
Mm.
that they can get some food into them very, very quickly. I've been there a couple of times and it works really well. And then you can always top them up with a bit of syrup afterwards, can't you?
It's a horrible scenario to describe, really, though, isn't it? You do
It
you
is.
do really feel like you failed at that point, even though they're just hanging on. You do feel like you failed them at that point.
Can I touch on something from the article that
Okay,
you've written? You say that you remember telling your mum, and for everyone that's listening, Paul and his mum are the team. This is,
yeah,
this there aren't lots and lots of workers in the background helping Paul here. It's just Paul and his mum. And in the article, you say that you said to your mum, I'm not sure that I can do this for much longer.
yeah.
Was that a real kind of deep depression kind of period in the season for you?
Yeah, I think it was for a lot of people as well. Speaking to other colleagues, it was almost like an industry-wide depression. A lot of us were in because it was just fighting to keep the bees alive at this point, and the forecast was just not showing any signs of letting up. Even people that I knew with bigger, deep boxes like Langstroths and commercial hives were at this point getting the bees were starving as well. So it was just yeah, it was just fighting to keep them alive, which was horrible.
Yeah,
And
and there's a wider issue here for the bee farming community in talking about mental health and
mm,
everybody communicating and having somebody to turn to because I'm quite lucky in that I have a lot of beekeepers that I talk to, not necessarily bee farmers, but a few bee farmers. But it's always easy to share when you've got people around you that are going through the same sort of thing. And I don't know if we as bee farmers have that community ready to kind of help out each other when mental health becomes, it's almost still a taboo.
yeah.
People don't like to say that they're struggling, and we probably need to just get past that.
Definitely. I think it's like all farming, isn't it? It's quite a mentally challenging job, and depression's rife, isn't it? I think.
It is.
And we forget that, I think. But there was one person that kind of got me out of it, snapped me out of it a bit. And you'll know him, Peter Heath. Do you remember Peter Heath?
I do, yeah.
So for the listeners, Pete, he'll hate that we're talking about him because he's such a just keeps to himself and non-assuming person. But he was a bee inspector for 40 years and a bee farmer for as long. And he managed about 300 hives, still does. And I called Peter up and I said, like, is it as bad down with you? And he said, yeah, it's probably the worst spring he's known in his entire career of 50 years bee farming. And he said it'll change in a day though. He said, a week's a long time in beekeeping were his exact words. And yeah, he just meant it'll change so quickly, and he was right, and it did. So we just kept limping on, we kept going, and eventually it did change.
Everything changed.
Mm.
And that was around mid-June time for you?
Yeah, it was, and it was unbelievably quick as well. So the bees that were starving on the mustard, I actually ran out of feed. I fed all the ones that were desperate, but there were some that needed a bit more food, and I ended up going back down 2 days later with some more food. But at this point, the weather had just turned; it had just warmed up enough, and there was nectar absolutely pouring in, just like that, just a switch. And there was nectar pouring in from the mustard. There was nectar pouring in from the spring beans at this point. Yeah, it was like a switch had just turned on, and thankfully it stayed on, and
Yeah.
it's once we got those warmer temperatures, the bees were able to get out. It was really humid for those. I don't know if you remember, it was really quite humid those first few weeks because of how wet it had been, and then it was warm. So it was like perfect honey conditions, perfect nectar producing conditions.
Can
Yeah.
I just talk about swarming for a
Yeah.
moment? In the article, there's not a great deal about swarming. Did you have any issues
No,
in
it was a really strange year for it, wasn't it? Obviously, your typical swarming time is May and early June, and it just didn't happen because the bees were just going backwards. The weather was not with them, was it? So swarming really didn't happen. We did start to see a bit of swarming later on in later June and early July, but it was still very, very small amounts, strangely enough. So
Yeah, that and that is probably the complete reverse of what I experienced because
okay,
I've probably suffered the worst swarming spring
right,
that I've ever had. We had probably half of our colonies swarm. It was slightly compounded by the fact that I'd had one or two health issues early in the year, so I'd kind of stepped back from doing as much physical work as I was doing, and undoubtedly missed some of the signs within a colony. But it seemed, certainly here in Norfolk, that I was hitting a warm spell. Then it went wet and miserable again, and then it warmed up a little bit, and I just didn't get boxes on early enough, I think.
okay,
And as a result, we lost very early swarms, and I think that came back to help me because they
mhm,
were so early. The bees recovered during that period of it being unsettled up to mid-June, and then the
mhm.
weather changed, as you say, and I think the bees were ready to get out and start doing stuff. And in your article, you mention sustainable farming initiative seed mixes and the fact that a lot of farmers have been sowing these mixed seed varieties on land that they couldn't drill with the usual crops. And that worked out well for you?
Yeah, so again, it was a bit of a fluke in a sense because and the title of the article is a perfect storm, and this is kind of what I refer to in that the poor spring we had and how wet things were led to a lot of farmers not being able to drill spring sown crops. They couldn't even get on the land. In fact, a lot of farmers were getting stuck on their own land in big tractors and needing to get pulled out by other farmers.
Right.
It was that wet up here.
Yeah.
So by the time we got into May, the last resort they had was taking these schemes where they get paid to grow these flower mixes, essentially nectar and seed mixes, essentially, which normally go in a bit earlier. Normally they would be drilled in winter or very early in spring. So because they were drilled later, they flowered later. They flowered perfectly for us end of June into July, all through July and into August, in fact. And they just poured with nectar as well because they'd established well. They'd obviously had the moisture in the ground and they just poured with nectar and they just kept going because there was a mixture of flowers. They all kind of flowered at different times and it just kept
Yeah.
going, didn't it?
We enjoyed exactly the same thing. We'd got a couple of farms. We're not running anywhere near as many colonies as you are, Paul, and we left some colonies on oilseed rape crops that hadn't done particularly well,
Mhm.
but we left them there because we were moving other bees to borage. And actually, I was almost shocked when I went
Yeah.
back to just check in on them, make sure that they weren't starving. I thought, well,
Yeah.
we've taken some oilseed rape off them. I better just make sure they're okay. And they were absolutely rammed with honey. And we were desperately chasing back to Norwich to grab some boxes to get back to them. And I'm scratching my head thinking, where on earth has this come from? And over the hedge line, there's this massive field of vetch and clover and various types of clover, I think, because it seemed to be flowering at different times, as you said. It's just a remarkable stroke of luck for me.
Yeah.
I suspect you're a little bit more on the ball, so luck
No,
doesn't play
it,
quite so much a part
it,
in what you're
it,
doing.
it was exactly the same for us. Although I knew where some of these fields were, these flower mixes, a
Yeah,
lot of them I was unaware of, and there were sites that I was prepping to move to borage, and I'd return a few days later to move them, and I couldn't lift them. There was honey on that I just didn't know was going to be there, and yeah, it was a fluke. It was a lot of it. was a fluke. It was just luck, I
It
think.
was it
Yeah,
was quite remarkable, I think, as you say, a perfect storm.
yeah,
I think the conditions this spring were kind of ripe for European foul brood to pop up. It
yeah,
was one of those scenarios where you'd got this cold, damp, warm, damp.
yeah,
It seemed to be damp all the time,
yeah.
and colonies being restricted into their
Stressed.
hives
Yeah,
and really running out of room.
yeah.
I'm surprised that I didn't see or hear of more European foul brood.
The,
Did you
the,
struggle with anything?
No, I was quite paranoid about it this year, same as you. It felt like a perfect recipe for it this year. A lot of stress, bees confined, starving, even, really
Yeah,
pushed their limits. And there has been a lot about from what I'm hearing from other bee farmers and inspectorate friends. I think it has been rife with it this year. But
right.
no, I was, although I do inspect my colonies every year looking for it, this year I was like really combing for it, looking for it with a fine tooth comb, and luckily I didn't find it. But yeah, I'm still suspicious that it could be out there. The amount of migratory work we do as well, one of these years it's going to come back, I think.
And when you say it's going to come back, do you think that that's your bees bringing it back from other colonies that have it, or do you think that it's in your colonies and just suppressed and hidden?
I think that'd probably be us picking it up somewhere. Yeah,
Yeah,
bees. I think that the biggest risk for us when we go to orchards and things like that is bees potentially, our bees potentially robbing out other colonies with it,
yeah,
or colonies that have died out over winter, things like that. That's probably the biggest risk. We used to have a big issue with it back when I first started. And I think you were still a bee inspector at the time that helped clean it up with
yeah,
my father's operation.
yeah.
Um, we had quite a lot of foul brood back then, and that really did sort of instill all these principles in me about dealing with it. But I think the biggest difference that improved things for us was the genetics. My dad's bees were very mongrelly bees, and they were prone to all kinds of things. Chalk brood, sack brood, loads of things like that. And when we got onto a better type of bee, should I say, I think they are more, not resistant to it, that's the wrong word, but yeah, maybe they do suppress it more. Yeah, because I think it's something that can occur in all bees. So
I, given the amount of stress that our colonies have been through
mhm.
this season, I do wonder whether it's hidden in every
Yeah,
colony. I don't see it,
yeah,
and I kind of question this approach that every colony's probably got it and it'll come out when they're stressed. Well,
mm,
I, I do put my bees through an awful lot of stress through the
yeah,
season, and combine that with the weather conditions. I would have thought that if it was in the colonies, it would have popped up by now. So I I tend to be with you on the bees robbing out
yeah,
colonies that have already got the infection, rather than stress being a factor that produces it almost instantaneously in
yeah.
in a colony. Um, do you think that your bees were particularly stressed through the spring?
Yeah, they must have been, really. They
Yeah,
must have been. Just the conditions alone were stressful, weren't they? There was periods where there was weeks where they just barely could get out of the hive.
yeah, yeah.
And I remember we had a few sites where, we would get very brief warm spells in the spring, it like just an hour where the sun shone and the bees got out, and then it clamped down so quickly. And I remember finding just dead bees clustered to the front of the hives because it got cold so quickly they just couldn't get back in the entrances quick enough. And yeah, lack of nectar, lack of pollen, pushed to the brink, really, starvation at some points. It's
And yet
yeah.
still they were able to keep EFB at bay, perhaps.
Yeah, so
It's
you're probably
interesting.
right.
So let's move on to your migratory season. So
Mhm.
you've had the bees down on various crops in the spring, and you mentioned the borage. You take your bees down to Essex for borage, and then how did they get on with the borage this year and the continuing SFI crops? What kind of average were you getting per colony?
It was quite a challenge when it came to move the bees to the borage, actually, because we start to move them late June, early July, and obviously at this point, think things were being held back a bit. So not in a normal year, everything works smoothly. One crop starts to end and another crop begins, and we can migrate between them. So, because of how cold conditions were this spring, the spring sown field beans, which flower in June, were maybe a week or two behind. So
Right.
they carried on flowering well into July. And as a result, there was still nectar absolutely pouring in when we needed to get the bees moved to the borage. So we had to hold off a little bit, moving the bees to the borage. And some of them we took down with supers of quite fresh nectar and honey, which is always a risk. But and we try and avoid moving bees with fresh nectar on. But we had to do it this year, and they were fine. But yeah, we got the
Paul, can I just
yeah
interrupt you?
yeah.
Why don't you like moving again for our
Sorry.
listeners? Why don't you like moving colonies that have nectar on?
When the nectar's wet, it and you jostle the hives and move the hives, it does pose a risk of literally pouring out of the cells when it's still
Right.
fresh, in my opinion. And the bees are busy drying it as well, I think, which is it creates a bit of heat and condensation and things when you're moving the bees in a van at least. And yeah,
Okay.
so I'm never a fan of moving them with dripping wet nectar on them.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. Okay.
Yeah.
So you've gone from the borage,
Yeah.
had a fairly good summer on the borage.
Yeah, it was probably the best crop we've ever had on the borage, amazingly. It was a really healthy looking crop again because it had lots of moisture in the spring, and there was moisture in the ground, and it yielded incredibly well. We did move the bees down to Essex, which is predominantly where it's grown these days, but we had a little bit up in Lincolnshire, which often doesn't do as well, but almost did as well as the Essex borage this year, interestingly. Yeah, and that took us through July. At the same time, we left a lot of bees at home on these SFI mixes. They continued to flower through July as the different flowers emerged, as
Yeah.
different plants emerged. I think we started with like mustard and radishes, and then Phacelia came up in July, and buckwheat and things like that. So it was a real staggered crop, and they continued to really produce well into July. And then we started moving a few bees up to the bell heather in late July, which is different to the ling. It flowers earlier, and it's a
Okay.
different plant altogether. So
Yeah. And in all this time, you've got all these supers being filled with honey, and what a dozen or so employees back at the honey room extracting the honey
that
for you.
that sounds great, doesn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
doesn't it?
Unfortunately, just not unfortunately, my mum was the one solely dealing with the extraction as she always does, and yeah, it was a real task keeping up with it because we like many bee farmers, we ran out of supers with this deluge of nectar coming in. So we had to continually crop the ripe supers, get it extracted, just so we had empty supers to put back on. And I guess the other thing that made it worse was it was also condensed because normally our extraction is throughout the entire summer. We crop regularly as we move from crop to crop. So it never really builds up. So, we'll start extracting in as early as early May some years, and it just carries on and it's staggered. But yeah, it was kind of like late June. It was just everything came in this really short window, and it was a challenge for me keeping up with the bees, and it was a challenge for my mum extracting it, I think. Yeah,
And
it was.
how do you clear your supers? Being migratory, when you go down to your bees and you've got supers that are ready to come off, how do you clear them and get the supers back to base ready for extraction?
We're still using clearer boards, rhombus clearer boards. Most sites are within a few hours, so it's not. In fact, most sites are within sort of half an hour from home, so it's not too bad. And then we have a few extreme sites that are maybe 2 hours away, but it's not too bad really. We go and inspect the bees, do your beekeeping, add empty supers that are needed, and clear a super off. So it's always we've got a good sort of system, a good cycle that we go through, and then yeah, return to the sites, pick up the full supers, and yeah, it works all right.
So do you leave them like 24 hours or something and then
Yeah,
get
not long. Usually the next day I'll go and get the full supers, and it gives you a second window if my mum's been busy extracting, we've got empty supers again then. So on the second day, it gives us a chance to maybe add a few extra supers if we'd run out on the first day and things like that. So
sure?
yeah.
And then you head off to the heather moors. Now I've had an absolute disaster this year on the heather moors because of the weather and the heather beetle.
Mhm.
And you're not in a too dissimilar location to me, North York Moors.
Yeah.
But I was on the western side, and you're more on the eastern side.
Yeah, we're quite close to the eastern edge of the moors, and we did okay. The bell heather yielded as well as I think I've ever seen it as well. That really did pour with nectar, and we crop the bell just as the ling starts normally, so we can differentiate the two honeys.
Okay.
And we did that. So we cropped the bell, and the ling was starting. You could see the ling was in full flower, although there were patches of beetle damage. And then it looked like the bees were going fantastic. It looked like there was loads of ling coming in, ling heather coming in. But when we actually came to harvesting, it just appeared that the bees had continued working the bell, and it was predominantly more bell honey coming in. And actually, our ling crop was it was okay. I wouldn't say poor, but it was average, which is better than nothing. But yeah, the bell is what really made the heather for us this year, luckily. But
Yeah.
it's so fickle normally. We take the bees to our bell sites every year, but it's been maybe 4 years since we had a decent crop from it. So it's, yeah, luck really again. Not luck, but yeah, yeah.
And just to, the question inevitably will be going through the listeners' minds. How much honey did you produce from around 250 colonies, if you don't mind sharing that with us?
We ended up with 32.5 ton, yeah, from
That's
250
remarkable,
hives.
Paul.
Yeah,
That is, it's almost unbelievable. That's a
yeah,
fantastic result for you.
it's
I
unbelievable.
guess the big question following on from that is,
Mm.
what on earth do you do with that much honey?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a worry actually because it's almost double what we produce in a normal year, and we do have good outlets. We still sell a bit in bulk in barrels, although that side of the market has really dwindled over the last 4 or 5 years. We sell a bit in buckets, and we're starting to sell more in jars. But really, yeah, it's a bit of a problem because yeah, it's just a
I
bit of a
guess,
problem.
is storage an issue? Have you got somewhere to be able to store it?
We're lucky. A few years ago, I built a bespoke unit to work from, and that gave us lots of space. But this has really pushed it to its limits. Really, we're okay for space, but if we carry the majority of this honey into next season, which I suspect we will, we're starting next year with limited space,
Yeah,
which is not a good start, really.
sure.
So a decision has to be made next year, really.
Looking forward to a poor season, presumably.
Well,
And
it's interesting you say that. The poor spring we had this year really did to get sales moving. The bulk sales even started to move again once we got into sort of late May, where it was looking like it was a write-off. It's
yeah.
incredible how quickly sales started to increase. So an entire bad season would probably totally correct the honey market, which is yeah, suffering a bit at the minute, I think.
Let's not wish for that, because
No,
I want to recover from my very average season this year
yeah.
and have a half decent season next
Maybe
year.
if I just have a bad season, it would sort things out then.
Perhaps it's time for a holiday, Paul.
An
Maybe
entire year, that would be good. Go
give the
away for a
rest of
year.
us a chance.
Yeah.
That would be good. So, on top of all of that, and I mentioned it earlier, you found time with Steve to write a book. And for anyone that hasn't yet been out and purchased the Healthy Bees, Heavy Hives book, you really do need to, because it's packed full of, I'm going to say Paul's wisdom, because you've got an awful lot of experience, Paul, and there's so much in there that is of use, not just to beginner beekeepers, but to beekeepers of all levels of experience. Have you got any plans for more books in the future? Have you got anything else
I
lined
think I,
up?
th- I think that was probably a one-off for me. It was just Steve that carried me through the writing process of that. Really, he dragged me along for the journey. Hopefully Steve will write another book at some point because he's an exceptionally good writer, and I enjoy reading his articles and his books. So yeah, but not no
Yeah,
no
sorry,
no
Steve. It,
sequels.
it wasn't just Paul, it was Steve as well. I do apologize. So, plans for next year. Have you started looking ahead that far, or is it too early for you?
No, no, always looking ahead and seeing what's about. We've spoken to a lot of the farmers we work with and seeing what crops they've got in. There's reduced amounts of oilseed rape around this year, but we've already found some areas that we're going to go to. These SFIs continue. It's a 3-year scheme for a lot of the farmers that opted into it, and It's going to be a very different story, I think, next year because, like I said, that they're in the ground now already. They've been drilled for next year, so they're going to flower a lot earlier than they did this year. So it's likely it'll just be, if the weather plays ball, there'll be a lot of forage in the spring potentially with these SFIs instead of the summer. But yeah, there's a dilemma really because as proud as I am of what we did, a lot of it was just down to the look of the season and it warming up and the look that these SFIs were everywhere. But it's left us with a decision really. I don't think I could do that again. It pushed me to my limits. It pushed my mum to her limits extracting, and I might cut back a bit next year. I might reduce the numbers 200 or less in spring. We'll see where winter takes us. We might have high losses, but cutting back a bit, whether I'll actually do that or not, but that's what I'd like to do, cut back a bit.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Okay, Paul, I really appreciate you coming onto the podcast to talk through your season. I know there's an awful lot of beekeepers out there that don't like to talk openly about their season. They don't like to share all of their pros and cons and the good bits and the bad bits, certainly not the bad bits. So it's been really refreshing to get an insight into your operation. I guess it leaves me to wish you a happy December. That particular time is going to hit us very soon. Christmas will be here upon us, and oxalic acid treatments will have to happen for most people. And then we'll be into the winter and waiting to see that out and see how the new season goes. Thanks for joining me. Maybe I can grab you again next year sometime and have a catch up, and we'll do it all again. But thanks for coming along.
Thanks for having me, Stuart. Anytime.
Well, that's it for this week. Don't forget to check out my website, www.norfolk-honey.co.uk, and for my latest videos and podcasts with more updates, tips and techniques, it's the same Patreon page, www.patreon.com/Norfolk Honey. And remember, I'm Stewart Spinks, and that was Beekeeping Short and Sweet.